Hello, I'm Andrew from Limitless Park, and this should be a pretty easy question to answer. What is the world's first roller coaster, and how old is it? Well, the oldest decade that I know is like the 1980s, so was it built then?
Let's see, we got Corkscrew at Alton Towers, no. Corkscrew at Valley Fair, no. Cork Space Screw at Bennyland, no.
Those all just look way too new to be the first roller coaster ever built. So if it wasn't built in the 80s, then when was it built? Was there a decade before the 80s?
Yep, it was called the 1600s. So the path to the answer of the first roller coaster ever built is a bit of a bumpy one, but there's mostly a definitive answer that we can get to. But let's go as far back as we can to see what I and many other people consider the predecessor of roller coasters. These were called Russian ice slides, and they date all the way back to the 1600s. They were essentially these massive wooden structures that were covered in ice, and riders would fly down them on sleds. Now they're really not true coasters at all since they don't have wheels, so they don't really coast, but they're still a pretty big ancestor in roller coaster history. They were mainly built around St. Petersburg, you know, the city by Tampa, and were just these popular attractions that people would ride on at different winter festivals and just recreationally whenever they had access to them. They had this serious do-it-yourself vibe to them, and it really makes me want to make my own, you know?
2, 3, you gotta start somewhere. 4.
The Russian ice slides continued into the 1700s when they became even more sophisticated, garnering popularity with the elites in Russia, including some lady named Catherine the Great, who was the Empress of Russia, who might have killed her husband. Maybe not. I don't know, but regardless, once she ended up in power, she became a big fan of Russian ice slides. Sure, they were symbols of wealth and power, but she was also apparently just a huge fan of European entertainment ideas, and the ice slides were uniquely Russian, so these things just kind of checked off all the boxes for her. I mean, I guess what I'm about to say is kinda a stretch, but it's not totally out the window to consider her the oldest famous coaster enthusiast.
Damn, I thought that title was held by Rob Alvey from Theme Park Review. Look how old and gross he is.
But whatever, like I said, these things technically don't count because they didn't have wheels. So what was the first coaster with wheels? Well, that also has connections to Catherine the Great? Seriously? Okay, so like I said, the Russian ice slides continued into the 1700s, and apparently there was a wheeled track at her summer palace. It was called the Riding Mountain, or that in Russian, and it was built sometime in the mid to late 1700s. It only operated during the summer, and it was only for private use, so the undesirables couldn't ride it, but since it was on a series of hills with grooved tracks and wheeled wooden carts on rails without any ice, it was gravity powered, and it also featured a mechanical lift hill like hoisting system. All signs point towards this being the first true roller coaster. Damn, Catherine was quite the innovator. I wonder if she posted a POV of her ride online like Rob Alvey does. Nope, doesn't look like it. Well, that's a bummer. She doesn't post any POVs online, she might have killed her husband. Man, that sucks. But at least she didn't get charged with embezzlement or tweet any of this garbage. And hey, I know, we all have some racy tweets from back in the day. I once tweeted out that Transformers The Last Night didn't suck. Wow, I should be put down for that. But you know who hasn't tweeted out anything bad? Catherine the Great, and that's why we should pay homage to her. That and the whole coaster thing.
But if that coaster was only for private use, then what was the first coaster ever used to make some sweet, sweet cha-ching? Cha-ching meaning money in French. It was in France.
Yeah, so let's jump to 1817. And okay, there were actually technically two different coasters at two different parks, but we don't exactly know which one came first. The first one we'll talk about is Les Montagnes Russes Belleville, which roughly translates to the Russian mountains of Belleville. Now, Belleville, or Belleville, I guess, I don't know, was a suburb of Paris at the time, and obviously the Russian mountains name is paying homage to the Russian ice slides we talked about earlier. But this one actually featured two tracks for racing, and the carts were all on some grooved rails, with the wheels being locked into place better for a safer experience. Safer in quotes. Now, the dueling aspect isn't what I meant by two coasters, though. Instead, there was actually another coaster called Promenades Aériennes. Well, that one was a little bit easier, but still horrible. This was located at a park in the Champs-Élysées area of Paris, which was a bit more upscale than Belleville and probably costed a bit more to ride. Let's put it this way, if the Russian mountains at Belleville was like Zippin' Pippin in Green Bay, Wisconsin, where you only have to pay like $1.50 to ride, then it was probably like West Coaster at Santa Monica Pier, which cost $15 for one ride, Jesus. But I will say the second coaster did have some bonuses. It had some actual curves on the ride instead of just just small hills. It also had a higher elevation and used a mechanical cable lift hill, which is pretty sick. So both of these coasters are pretty important and opened the same year and had various innovations that we find on most coasters today. So while the one in Russia was the first coaster ever, these ones were the first publicly available and had a lot more of that coaster feel to them.
But hey, Russia and France? I don't want to hear about those places. I'm an American. If there's two things that I don't like in this world, it's Russia and good public transportation. France is a close third. But if France was messing around making coasters in the early 1800s, then what was the USA up to? Why couldn't they make coasters?
Oh, yeah, we were doing other stuff. Well, like 10 years later, the US built their first official roller coaster. It was 1820 and those goofballs in Pennsylvania were out there mining coal to keep their cars running, I don't know. But in 1827 they decided a regular mining track wasn't cool enough and they converted the track into the Mauch-Chunk Switchback Railway, which is widely considered to be the first coaster ever built in the US. The track was like 9 miles long and would actually reach a speed of like 50 miles per hour, which is actually pretty crazy for the time. It didn't transition into an official tourist attraction until the 1870s, but once it did, it was drawing hundreds of thousands of people to it, which for a time made it the second most popular attraction in the US after Niagara Falls. Now obviously gravity did the work for when the car was heading down the hills, but when it needed to go uphill, I guess they attached mules to the cars and pulled them up, and I don't know what attaching a vodka cocktail with ginger beer will do, but I guess it worked for them. But later in the mid-1840s they actually upgraded the ride to feature 2 steam-powered inclines, which got rid of their beverages of choice, and also added an anti-rollback ratchet safety device, which basically was a precursor to the coasters of today. It was just a really popular thing to do, and Mauch-Chunk was already a pretty beautiful sight to behold, so the coaster ride was just adding to it. I mean, apparently other famous people like President Ulysses S. Grant, Prince Maximilian, and Thomas Edison all visited. So while they might not be confirmed coaster enthusiasts, it's possible we can add them right behind Catherine.
Okay, so now we know the first coaster-like ride, the first private coaster, the first public coasters, and the first USA-based coasters. Is that good enough? No, I won't be able to sleep until I talk about at least, I don't know, one more first coaster?
Well, while everything we've discussed so far definitely counts, what about a coaster that was specifically built for amusement purposes and not just a repurposed track like Mauch-Chunk or the French coasters that were added to other existing parks rather than built as standalone attractions? If we go off of that criteria, then the first true roller coaster was Gravity Pleasure Switchback Railway, which opened at Coney Island in New York City on June 16, 1884. It was opened by inventor Lamarcus Adna Thompson, and he was really looking for that sweet cash. That's New Yorker for money. He really just wanted to attract tons of paying customers, and man did this thing do its job. It was making around $600 a day shortly after opening, and while that barely covers a PS5 today, when you calculate for inflation, $600 in 1884 becomes like 39 PS5s back then. Nice. Now for the actual ride experience, riders went up a 50-foot platform, there was no lift hill, and then they took a 600-foot downhill ride at 6 miles per hour. Wow, I was gonna say take that Falcon's Flight, but I think Falcon's Flight does at least 7 miles per hour, so never mind. But still, this thing also operated with return trips once the cars were turned around, and guests were just huge fans of the experience overall. So that led Thompson to patent the coaster design and build it at a ton of other locations, so places all over America and even Europe got to experience his scenic railways. So there you have it. The Russian ice slides were the first things that we know of that were ever made to resemble coasters. Then Catherine the Great's Riding Mountain was the first real coaster with wheels and everything, and then the 2 in Paris were the first public coasters. The Mauch-Chunk Switchback Railway was the first coaster in the US, and finally the Gravity Pleasure Switchback Railway was the first purpose-built, standalone amusement roller coaster. Now you know where babies come from. I mean coasters.
And that's it. What, you thought I was kidding about sleeping after talking about one more first coaster? No way, man. I am so tired right now. I've been awake since Thursday last March trying to talk about one more first coaster. I am exhausted. No more quips or bits or anything. Good night, Internet.